How's the quiz team going?
Solid.
Oh gosh, you guys have got to lift the performance.
Is that we might have kick off. There's only Nina to come here, and Clint's online. Not sure whether Justin is here either, but Jonathan's just had to nip out for half an hour. So let's kick off. Sorry. And Rogan as well. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for coming today for our workshop on the proposed granny flat exemptions. So we're going to quickly provide an overview of the current MB proposal to exempt dwellings of up to 60 square metres from requiring a building consent. Running through quickly what some of the staff feedback has been on the proposal and seek a steer from you as to whether we make a submission on this, and if we do, what the submission should include. So obviously that's the question we're asking: should we submit, and what should be in the submission if we do? And this is in the do square of the triangle, square segment of this triangle. Obviously, luckily this is not a geometry test. That's fine. So just one thing before we start, I think the term granny flat is a little bit, it's sexist and ageist for a start. Grannies need a place to live, but then so do koros and granddads, small families, couples. So probably a better term is a minor residential unit or a minor dwelling, and I think that's going forward. If we submit, I think we should put that forward, and a minor residential unit is actually defined in the National Planning Standards, so we've got these standardised definitions, so it'd be great if we could use them across all of the relevant legislation and regulations. No cat ladies. Well, possibly some of these people have cats, but surely Granny, that's the... Let's do a story about a man named Jed. You didn't know you're getting singing as well as a workshop, did you? There we go. There we go. We didn't know we were looking like that though. She was only about black and white. Didn't actually realise she came in a coloured version. There we go. So, MB have got a proposal out currently that they're consulting on to exempt minor dwellings, minor residential units of up to 60 square metres from requiring a building consent. It's a very simplified version. We'll go through the full ramifications shortly. And this change would require changes to the Building Act, the Resource Management Act and the Local Government Act. With regards to the Resource Management Act component, the preferred option is to bring in a national environmental standard, which would mean that we have, it'd be like the current national environmental standards that we have for things like contaminated land. So the rules of that would override the district plan, and it would be a separate, if it needs a consent under that NES, it would be a separate consenting path to the district plan. And obviously submissions are closing on Monday, so we do need to act quickly if we want to submit. One of the things about if we have an exemption from the Building Act, there are proposals for us to be notified and to allow for things like development contributions to be taken. One option is via an RMA process where they create a permitted activity notice, or a PAN, which is a tool for recording that there's a minor dwelling on the site that doesn't need a resource consent. It'd be probably quite similar to a certificate of compliance under the RMA. And the second is under the Building Act, and there'd be a tool similar to a project information memorandum would need to be supplied prior to construction, but it's a little bit, the guidance is unclear as to whether the information gets provided, but whether they actually have to, whether there is any onus on council to do any sort of checking or any sort of certification under that, whether it's just simply providing the information, and this is for things like, things in a project information memorandum would be things that we know about the land, like is it subject to liquefaction, is there a flooding risk, have we got an overland flow path there, it's those sort of things that we'd be providing, but there doesn't seem to be any onus on us to check the plans against it, so it feels like a bit of a strange.
Which before the session started, Penny and I were just talking about, either of these options both of these options would also trigger a connection, but we would become aware of this through a connection to sewer, right? Like, so when they went to do it, there would be a fee and because we'd need to understand the impact on capacity of wastewater. Yeah.
That is kind of the trick with it, is that so there are at least 12 conditions for it to be permitted, not requiring requiring a building permit. One of them is that they connect to the reticulated network where it's available, so that would obviously indicate that they would need a connection, and this notification tool, I think, is our trigger for requiring the connection and then requiring a development contribution. But there's probably a little more work that needs to be done around that to make sure that it is if this is the system that goes ahead, that it's a robust system.
And I mean, I take it you've read the plans for change in detail that the government have put out, and so a question like that in a submission to understand exactly what triggers and what doesn't, rather than, because I'm not interested in assuming, I just want to know the facts.
I think that if we were to make a submission, that'd be a very good point to make in the submission, that we do need clarity exactly around how this is going to work. And that I don't think the material that's come out so far, I don't think really covers how that would work in practice. They've just, it seems that they've identified a potential issue, and these are solutions to that potential issue without really going into how it's going to work. So in the past financial year, we had 13 applications for minor dwellings under 60 square metres, and then a further 4 dwellings were between 60 and 63.5, and I've included those just because sometimes if you're planning a dwelling of that size, you might make it slightly smaller so that you could get it in as a permitted one. There didn't seem to be anything sort of in that. The next jump was sort of up to 70 square metres, but the average value of the buildings, where there was a full building, was around $149,000, and the average building consent cost for a new build was $5,000, but yard built dwellings were more like $3,000 for the building permit.
How quickly was the turnaround, those 13 applications? Because I'm assuming one of the imperatives driving this is about timeliness, getting on with the business of building. How quick was the turnaround from the application being into the consent being granted?
That information wasn't easy to extract from the system. That's quite fine-grained information that our reporting doesn't really seem to cover off. We could probably manually extract the information and supply it just for information purposes, but that was, I think if you've had time to review the Taituara submission, that is one of the critiques of the current proposal, is that there really doesn't seem to be any good information about why we've got a problem with small dwellings of up to 60 square metres. And the current reporting doesn't really require that sort of setting them out into.
So just to finish my thinking, they're using Councillor Jennings' phrase, what is the problem statement? So if it's about timeliness to build, and if it's about the cost implications versus how that sits as a percentage in terms of the overall build, what is the problem?
That's right. When I met with the head of the building team this morning, he didn't seem to think that there was a big hold up from our end with these sorts of 60 square metre dwelling is a relatively minor consent, and he didn't seem to think that there was, if everything's in order, if all of the plans are provided, that they should be done fairly quickly and well under the 20 working days. One thing he did note, though, was we have a re-inspection rate for building consents of around 30%, which is probably lower than some of the other councils. But it did seem to be that yard-built dwellings, which are, they're your standard format dwellings that are built en masse, cookie cutter essentially, they seem to have as high a rate of re-inspection as other buildings. It doesn't seem to be that that's necessarily an indicator that they would be more likely to meet the code first time than any other building. So it was just an interesting sidebar there. So in terms of building Act exemptions, we've got 5 options that are being consulted on. The first one is a blanket exemption of dwellings up to 60 square metres with no conditions. The second condition, and that's the preferred option, is an exemption for buildings up to 60 square metres, but there are some additional criteria which we'll go through shortly to reduce the perceived risk from these buildings. The third one is an opt-in self-certification for accredited companies and professionals, so that may include more than just the small standalone houses. And options 4 and 5 are fast-tracked options that are being proposed there. The Taitoa submission seemed to go for almost an option 6, that they were proposing the current building consent process with a fast-track option for these buildings, and then using there's a $71 million excess fund for MB from the levies, I think it is, and to use that money to pay for the building consents. So MB would pay council to process them. So the cost, then that takes the cost aspect away from the applicants. It would simply just be then that we have the building consent done, we have all of the inbuilt insurances from that process. There'd be no cost to the applicants, and it would simply be hopefully up to a 10-day wait, and that would be at 2 weeks, which is another option to consider or support.
So what are the key drivers to introducing this? Other than building more houses, what's the key drivers?
That seems to be the key driver, because it doesn't seem to be, from the reading that I've done on it, there doesn't seem to be a good discussion of what the actual problem is.
No, I mean, they obviously have a strong appetite to do this. Why? What are they intending to solve, or why are they effectively changing rules to enable this? What are those drivers?
It does seem that with the current new builds, it does tend to be 3 bedrooms and over is the majority of the buildings that are built, and there's going to be increased demand as we go on, and as the population ages for these smaller units of 1 to 2 bedrooms. They seem to be, I think, about 25% of the building stock is 1 to 2 bedroom, and we're going to need a greater proportion in the future. So I think this is intended to facilitate those sort of buildings being built, but whether they hit the mark with what they're proposing or not.
So your earlier comment about let's define it as a minor dwelling rather than a granny flat, are they using the word granny flat because they want to support intergenerational living and having 3 generations shared on one site? The parents, grandparents, and the children, whatever that looks like for families. Or is it about parents helping their children into their sort of, I guess, independent living, still living on site, but a step up onto the property ladder, which is getting more and more harder to achieve? I mean, I'll speak for young people. It might have been hard 5 years ago, but it's even harder now. So this is some of why I think there is a need for this to some degree. So what really are we trying to intercept? Like, what do we not want to happen? What are the key things that we would want to have an intervention about, or ensure that these things are covered and that can happen? or actually we don't like the idea, we don't support those ambitions or whatever, and we're going to apply all these other things to the conversation that are potentially going to hinder. That's what I want to understand.
Because I think we need, in response, but I think what we need to identify is what are the fallouts for us in terms of the impacts on our infrastructure systems and so on. When we are not aware of these builds taking place, and yet it will affect stormwater, wastewater, etc. And there's real risks around that. So I think those are really key questions of what exactly is driving this. What is the problem statement? What are they seeking to solve that is an identified problem at present? Because we've heard locally, we've heard from Lisa just now, that the building consent process for these small units is pretty seamless. So I'm cautious. Initially I thought great idea, but once you start digging down, is this another case of council picking up the fallout as a result of this initiative?
Yeah. I'm not completely blind to the flow-on effects that could be, but how much of that can actually be realised, quantifying it, and where's the data to support it, because it's lacking at the moment. Justify it. 13? That's like a dozen across the district. And while that might double with this opportunity, is that still a problem? Like, what do the numbers say?
It seems to me that the spirit of this thing is actually empowering people to come up with housing alternatives in a national situation where affordable housing is a real issue. I would not support anything we do here by way of a submission that would add any complications to making that easier.
Noted. I think so to come back to sort of the first question, I think the term granny flat is being used because it's familiar. I don't think there's any intention to preempt who might live in these buildings, and that's why I think throughout the discussion document they do sort of interchange the terms, but I'm not sure why they chose granny flats to lead it with, because it does sort of have an implication for it as it's for older people only, but it would appear that the intention is to provide these additional smaller dwellings and not preclude younger people living in them, or single people or small families if that's what they want to do. But there are, as we go through it, some of the conditions that are on the building consent and the proposed standards to come in sort of, I think, make it clearer what they're trying to control. So shall we come back to this discussion once we've gone through those and see if some of the standards answer those questions, because they are quite, like I said, there's sort of 12 standards in the building consent side of it, and then another 7 or 8 for resource consent. So it's certainly not a simple thing. And I think, again, what might happen here, as happens with every other Building Act exemption, that's probably another point too, is you can already build a 30 square metre sleep out without a building consent at this stage. I think there's sort of been a relaxing of what needs a building consent over the past few years, but I think this is an extension of that, sort of going from that to this. It seems to be that there's sort of a number of things that are coming through. I have a point there.
I think what the spirit of this proposal is about trying to reduce barriers to delivering alternative or more affordable types of housing. However, I think it's assuming that the barrier to delivering that type of housing right now is the time and the cost associated with obtaining building consent. And I think probably what our reflection is from our research and having read, the Taituata submission, is that right now there isn't the evidence there to support that is the true barrier to delivering more affordable or alternative types of housing within one site. So it's probably a case of seeing that there's a problem and jumping to potential solutions without necessarily understanding the full spectrum of barriers first.
Are you going to articulate in the presentation those full spectrum of barriers?
I'm not sure that we're aware of the full spectrum of barriers, but I think the ones that council can control, I think we're quite across those. And then again, the potential issues that might be brought up by taking the building consent process away and the risks to people and tenants and, from terms of insurance and lending, I think those need to be thought about to a degree too, even though we can't control some of those. But these are probably unintended consequences, perhaps, of what's being proposed.
May I just jump in on one around barriers? I think, Peter, you mentioned financial. One thing we could make sure we reflect is, for example, because the building consent process now is a good lever for us to ensure that we've got payment for development contributions and also that we've got a rating unit coming on stream, that it is the barrier for us from a financial side. Will be more challenging for that 200,000 roughly of 13 units equates to from a development contribution to have that lever for collection, because at the moment we can hold on to a CCC certificate or a 224 until they pay. And then also we know currently that people are developing a new unit, so we can make sure the rating unit is created at the end of the year. So in the submission we can make sure some of those challenges are mentioned, because they do need to be factored in.
Yeah, didn't I just hear about an MB levy that can pay that towards the council costs? Oh, was that an option 6 or something that you floated?
There is a fund there. It's in the Taitoa submission. It mentions the excess building levy fund or something that they have.
And those kind of ones could be really useful for us because they allow us still to have all the same ability to understand the process, but it takes the cash requirement away from the person that's developing and brings it in from the government instead. Yeah.
Just as a quick aside, Jacinta Ward, we have 2 Jacintas in the room, has kindly pulled some quick figures from authority for us. So family flats, which are what we call granny flats or minor buildings, issued within 11 days and granted within 13 days seems to be the average. So it's really not, when you've got 20 working days, and it's really not far off that 10 working day target that would come under a fast track. So I think that'd be very achievable if that was the tack we were to go down.
What if it's not just about the response time? What if it's about the time it takes them to put the application together and submit it? That could be the onerous and hard part for applicants.
There would be a time for that, but then if they're going to have a builder build, they need plans for a builder to build off. You need building plans before you start, so they're always going to need those. And I'm not sure that there's much more detail in what we require than what a builder would need on the site to.
Is what you've just discussed though? Oh, sorry, but what you just discussed though is what's proposed through options 4 and 5, isn't it? Where basically there's ready-made plans or pre-approved plans, and so they just pick up the plan design, so that's where that cuts that time out.
Having said that build ready process that's referred to, that's been in place or available to people for 3 years but hasn't really got off the ground yet. So it's there. So in terms of the Building Act, these are the conditions, and I've paraphrased them, but from the guidance documentation. The first is that the building would need to be designed and built in compliance with the building code, which would indicate they need plans anyway. New builds only, so you couldn't convert an existing building or a garage, for example. A standalone dwelling only. In a single building, you couldn't have what's it called, like a duplex. Yeah, you couldn't have 2 of them together to make the 60 square metres. Up to and including 60 square metres, but there's a bit of a trick with this this proposal is that the 60 square metres actually refers to the net floor area, which is an internal measurement, whereas every other thing refers to your gross floor area, which is your external measurement of your building wall. So it's a potentially confusing.
So that can be like 60 square metres of dwelling plus 60 square metres of garage or portico type thing. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's sort of more that the width of your walls are actually excluded. So it's that, it's probably 100 mils, is it, by the time you've got your 150
But when
mils?
I had a look at it, it's like the entire plane. So when you have a plane, it shows you the entire outlay of, whereas I understood when I was reading this is it's the internal floor, so it doesn't account for the walls. So actually you could end up with 63, 64 metres, but you're only applying for 60. Yeah.
It could actually be that you end up with sort of maybe 300 to 400 mils by the time you have your exterior cladding on it as well. And that's on either side, so that's... Well, a roof area you could have like veranda, or your roof you could have extra large eaves and the like. It's just an odd measurement, that's all. So worth pointing out, probably worth putting in a submission that that's an odd measurement if that's the tack we take. No, no. And that's for someone trying to work it out. If someone comes and presents their plans to us to notify us that they've got it there, it actually would take extra time to work out how big the building is, because it wouldn't be a simple perimeter. It would be this room, this room, this room. The setbacks, they've got no. There's two options there for setbacks: either the building's own height from the boundary, and 2 metres away from other buildings, which would probably be your fire separation, 1 metre each, or 2 metres from any other building or boundary. Are the two options that they're proposing there. Different again to what's proposed under the NES, but it's a start. Maximum of 1 storey, so you can have a 1 metre floor height and then 4 metres above the floor level. Which a 1 metre floor height might be fine, but if you're in a floodable area it might not. And that seems to be that if you're in a floodable area and need, say, 1.5 metres, you wouldn't be able to be exempt under this. You would need to do a building consent. You need to have interconnected smoke alarms throughout, and electrical gas heating only, so no wood burners. It's only available for wind zones up to high, so none in the very high wind zone. And they need to have a timber or light steel construction and lightweight products being used only. Obviously they need to meet weather tightness standards as well, which is probably part of the building code. Plumbing work has to be carried out by a licensed person, and simple plumbing and drainage only. Wastewater and stormwater by gravity, not by pump. Potable water systems only, and controlled heat source water heaters only, which I think is just your standard electric water heating like you have in a house. Interestingly, you couldn't have a tiled shower in one of these. You'd have to have just your standard lined acrylic shower. Yeah, no tiles. And it must be designed and built by a competent LBP, if not a multi-proof or built ready. So these are sort of things that... I guess the problem is with these...
building practitioners, is that what that is?
Yep, sorry, LBP, yeah.
So it's either got to be that or a ready built property, which, where you buy them these days, they're very water standard. Like,
I can't help but think that, do we really need to go here? I mean, are we trying to put a handbrake on this by making a submission or put it through the complicator? I mean, really, if this legislation is about empowering people to find housing alternatives and solutions in very challenging times, the only submission I believe we should be making or consider making is in complete support of it. End.
So just in response to that, Mike, I'm supportive of people building homes, but if the homes that end up being substandard and our ratepayers have to pay for them to be brought up to code, that's what concerns me. We've had leaky homes in New Zealand, and they were all built by LBPs. So, it's not like it doesn't happen. And it's happened around the country. So, again, while in principle, I understand that, we've had lots of builders that have been out there and they're licensed, and they've built houses that then require other things to happen to them, and you're the second, third person that might be in it. If it's on your whenua, who pays for that? And I didn't realise that we were liable, but I've seen at this council table at times when houses may be built somewhere that it shouldn't have been because there was no code or whatever. That, you know, so that's what concerns me is the level of oversight that if those things do happen and our ratepayers then have to pay for that to be, you know, rectified, remedied, that's what concerns me about it. Otherwise, yeah, we've got no oversight.
I hear what you're saying, Nina, and I can sympathise with that point of view. But I mean, we're not here to protect our ratepayers from our ratepayers, and we're not parents either, and we're not here to stop people doing stupid things. Like, you know, if someone's stupid enough to build anything in a floodplain, you know, really. And the other thing too is that these conditions, to me, make it pretty plain that we're not lowering the bar or lowering the standard of what's being built. But yeah, that's just what I think.
I guess one quick comment is obviously all of our buildings at the moment are having to be built by a competent LBP, and we've still got a 30% re-inspection rate. So that's, you know, that is the current situation as well. Current buildings are failing their inspections and having to be re-inspected, and that's with the building consent process in place. Without it, we wouldn't know what's failing.
And so is there a consequence to that? Did they get reported to MB? The ones that keep failing? There's surely, we don't just, now you're shaking your head. Because if there is regular occurrences like that from the same operators, surely they get reported, and then you eliminate them from the sector, and then you don't have these ongoing issues. Like,
Don't you just get RFIs and you rectify them and then you get a tick? Is that right?
Not I mean, the only if they're outliers, then they might get taken to MB or someone for consideration, but generally not a lot happens. The 30-odd% inspection fails mean they can be varied in minor or major, and they happen through all sorts of aspects around the build. So I don't think we don't have any lists of anyone who's failing specific items continually or anything. That would sort of warrant them removing their ticket, I doubt.
Then the final two conditions, or points, is the owners must notify council prior to doing the work, including providing indicative plans and requesting the known land features. We will have the ability to charge an administration fee on this, but it does seem to be just an information for our information only, and obviously then we'd click in the development contribution and the connection process. We would need to obviously alter our development contributions policy to allow for this, because it's not currently one of the triggers for taking a DC, because it doesn't exist.
so effectively we know at the beginning and we know at the end that it exists, that it hasn't been built in, and we're oblivious to it. So for me, that ticks a box.
It's assuming people follow the process. If they don't, there's a $1,000 infringement payable, but people might take the risk for $1,000 if they're going to dodge $21,000 in development contributions. That's the trick.
Do we do that thing that other councils do, where there's like, I'm going to say aerial surveillance, but I don't mean it in that case. It's sense.
Put the drones.
But because councils do it with pools, right? To see who's put up a pool to then determine who's followed the right process and has got the pool inspection, all that kind of stuff. But do we do that from a building act perspective?
No. Not that I'm aware of.
I know that some New Zealand councils use aerial imagery, and there's an assessment that's done to say, have you done any building work or pool? And I think it's pools was the main one that they used it for. But
I think typically we would respond to complaints. So often, your neighbour might dob you in for putting in a swimming pool and not fencing it, or building a granny flat, and I mean, they wouldn't necessarily know, I suppose, if you were building a granny flat without consent. They might just assume you had gone through the process, whereas I guess an unfenced swimming pool is quite obvious to people, and they probably generally report it.
We used to pay about $40,000 a year for Google imagery every couple of years. Does that still happen here?
I don't know what we pay for it, but we still have access to regularly updated aerial photography.
We are redoing our bylaws though, at the moment on water, right? And so we could build something into that to provide a trigger, because what we're worried about is people avoiding paying DCs, right? That's the only thing that people have thrown up as, or that we've thrown up as kind of a key downside to this. Is that a fair assessment? And so surely it's that connection into our, well, that's only articulated, but yeah, it's in the urban environment would be the connection into our system network that would be the optimum trigger to capture that. But I suppose outside of the urban network, we wouldn't have such mechanism.
Again, without plumbing inspections and the like, then you could connect into current services quite easily as a family flat on the back of your section. Just connect your existing water supply and your existing sewer to your house. No.
Yeah. So, in terms of the district plan, because it's sort of a two-pronged thing with the building consent and the RMA, our district plan already allows for family flats as a permitted activity in both the residential and rural zones. In the residential zone, you can have up to 50 square metres as of right, and 70 square metres in the rural zone. So that 50 square metres in the residential zone, while it is slightly smaller, that's gross floor area, so possibly the 60 square metres might be more like it once you only took the living space, the internal space into account. Well, it doesn't really actually talk about decks or verandas and the like. It just talks about the building itself, the residential space. So the district plan is slightly it's a bit more permissive in the rural zone, but less permissive in the residential zone currently. And you can have a higher building in the rural zone in terms of siding height. But we'll quickly whip through. I've done a quick. So there's three options for how it might be dealt with under the RMA. First one is status quo, so each council does it themselves through their district plan, or not, as they see fit. The second one is a national policy statement, which is essentially they bring in objectives and policies, and councils will set their own rules based on those objectives and policies, but you'd have to do a plan change to bring that in. The third one is national planning standard, which would bring in rules for minor residential units, but again, we'd probably need a plan change for that. And the fourth option is a national environmental standard, which sits above the district plan, so it'd be another means for requiring a consent. But they would have some set out permitted activity standards, which going through. So for the residential zone, the proposed standard is a maximum internal floor area of 60 square metres, which compares to our 50 squares, plus we allow for a 10 square metre veranda, unless you're in the large lot residential zone, our greenbelt, or sort of those greenbelt areas where 70 square metres is permitted. This is the trick, is it one minor residential unit per site where there is a principal residential unit. So this option, whilst it's meant to be empowering and enabling these additional types of housing, you do have to have a primary dwelling there first in order for the second one to be permitted. The proposed standard, I'm not quite sure I can't understand why they're so hit up on this, but this standard about must be held in common ownership with the principal residential unit on the same site. A bank will not lend if you don't own the land. You can't get a building consent at the moment. If you don't own the land, you have to produce either a certificate of title or a sale and purchase agreement. So this seems to be an odd, but this
allow you to possibly divide the section. That'll
that's what I'm saying. I don't think that's what this is about. This is about family and intergenerational living, and that to me sort of highlights the fact.
But I think also at the same time it actually excludes, like if you're, if you've got a young adult who wants to build a house, you've got the land, they can provide the building, but they don't own the land, so they can't do it. It's excluding them from doing that. Or if you had an older parent who'd sold their property and wanted to build on your property, they wouldn't be able to do that under that standard. It just seems to be an odd standard to have included in there because the current system
Yeah,
doesn't
but then
really
you're
allow for it.
assuming that everyone is in that same. Like every story is different. Every family operates quite uniquely, and this, for me, is.
Lynch would be here if you use this exemption process to build a family flat or a minor residential on your unit, and so at that point in time you're complying with a standard where the same person owns both, but then in the future someone wanted to come along and subdivide that property, what does that then mean for the dwelling that you built on the site under the exemption process? Because now they're void from the exemption process, but the dwelling's already built. I think the only pathway there would be a certificate of acceptance under the Building Act, and those aren't necessarily always able to be issued, especially once a building's already complete and you can't go back and actually see what's behind the walls. So there is perhaps a risk in this process that if you choose to go down that pathway, you make it much more difficult for yourself to subdivide in the future.
And also I think this particular standard actually prevents people from doing the likes of papakainga as well. Whereas, if the land isn't multiple ownership or joint ownership, if someone wants to come and put their building on a sort of like a leasehold situation, it precludes that as well. So it just seems to be an odd, because you could have a side agreement with the landowners to put your
Not
building
necessarily. I mean, that's not how we build our papakainga, so this is common ownership. And sometimes it's the hapu that owns the land, and the actual individual families only own what's on top of it. But the land itself remains with the whole. Yeah, but you can still do both, can't you? Is this eliminating one for the other? I'm just saying there's two ways of doing things. Is this exempts that other version completely?
So that proposal,
or just for these sizes? Yeah, just for this one.
that proposed requirement there, the minor residential units have common ownership, that is restrictive. So it basically eliminates non-traditional arrangements of the nature that you just described. So it's more restrictive, and so I think that's what you're saying is that it's actually not sensible to include that as in the proposal, or to submit on the proposal saying it's not sensible because it probably won't allow for the types of more flexible, agile arrangements that we might like to see.
Ours is rural though. We're rural, not residential, and quite expensive.
That's the next slide.
The standard is about requiring the dwelling units to be held in the same ownership rather than the land being held in the same ownership, which I think is what the challenge is. It's not saying that the land has to be held in ownership. It's saying the main dwelling and the second dwelling need to be owned by the same person. So if you had a papakainga development where the land was owned by a hapu, for example, but then this dwelling was owned by family A and this dwelling was owned by family B, that couldn't proceed under this.
This.
Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah.
To utilise this process, yes.
Yes. So this standard would only be, you could have, if it was to go through as it stands, one minor residential unit per site that wouldn't need a building consent. A second minor residential unit, a third, a fourth, a 15th would need building consent. Would only be the first that would be exempt under this. Probably The conditions that were going to cause the most issue, I think, for this district is the maximum building coverage. So we currently have a maximum of 35% for sites up to 500 squares and 40% for sites over 500 square metres. And that's primarily because we don't have reticulated stormwater from the sites, because we have to allow for soak pits and things like that. So the soak pits have to be is it 1.5 off the boundary, I think, and then they have to be outside of the zone of influence of the dwelling, so have to be set back from the dwelling as well, so they don't interfere with the foundations. So allowing for a second soak pit on the side and ensuring that the graded flat's not accidentally put over an existing soak pit are going to be an issue, but those maximum building coverages, I think 50% is a worry, 70%, that is potentially a large issue with our, the soils here they're not free draining in some parts of the town in the district, so that has the potential to be a big issue. And these would be national standards, so there is no deviation from them. We would have to abide by these. We would have to allow these graded flats to be established on sites that would currently be considered at maximum capacity. They'd be allowed another 15%, 10% coverage, and then there would be a corresponding minimum permeable surface of 20 or 30% of the site, which we don't have that currently in the district plan, but essentially there has to be pervious surfaces. Minimum of 20 or 30%, depending on which one. They've currently got a number of options there.
Remind me how much we allowed for our tareka permeable surface for each lot.
The building it was just a building coverage rather than an impervious coverage standard. So, and it's the same. It ranges between 35, mostly between 35 and 40%, 50% in a medium density area where you would have a more a detailed stormwater design, effectively. But in this case, if we were getting up around 60, 70% building coverage, it could be very difficult to then be able to fit the soak pits on the site too.
Sweet. And then, so the setbacks, they've got three options for us. Either 1.5 metres off the front boundary, 1 metre off the side and rear boundary, which is essentially sort of getting into where you put a garage now, except for the front boundary standard, but it is that bit closer. 2 metres off the front boundary and 1.5 off the side and rear, or no minimum setbacks. Are the options that we've been asked to consider. The maximum height we've already been through would be 5 metres. And then in terms of height to boundary, which is what they've called basically distance from other buildings, own height from other buildings, or 2 metres from other buildings. So you can see that the setbacks here are different again from what's proposed to be exempted under the Building Act. So that's something to be aware of. In terms of the rural zone, we've got the same floor standard, same one minor resident unit per site, but that common ownership standards there. No building coverage maximum, because rural sites are larger. But the permeable surface standard seems to still be there, even though there's no maximum building coverage. They haven't seemed to have taken the permeable, or not mentioned the permeable surface for rural, so we have to assume it's there. The setbacks for rural zones are 8 metres off the front boundary and 3 metres side and rear, or no minimum setbacks. The current district plan, we have a number of setbacks looking at different things, but you'll see there that we have extra standard there for setbacks from waterways, and then setbacks from potentially noxious or offensive activities in terms of smell, not piggery, effluent farm, effluent plantation, forestry, aggregate extraction. There I've got extra standards there, which we do have national environmental standards that require those setbacks as well, which need to come into play. And then the height to boundary. There are some nice examples of small houses. This is my favourite small house in Vogel Street in Palmerston North. There's a Kaingaora development that's there's 3 of these houses on a 60 square metre site. This one, it's 1.5 metres off the front boundary, so it is, you can see, quite a lot closer than what they traditionally are, but I think they are quite nice looking buildings. It's quite a good use of the site. And then the floor plan there, so this is a 52 square metre building. It's a 1-bedroom unit with a bathroom area and then a kitchen lounge that you could at 60 square metres you could put another bedroom on that. And so these are some of the fish hooks that get picked up by the current building consent system that would not be considered, or that council would not be required to check. We'd be required to tell them that they're there. Buildings over easements, buildings over overland flow paths, buildings over soap pits, natural hazards. So any of the sites we've identified that are subject to liquefaction, the TC2 and TC3 standard foundations wouldn't necessarily come into play because we wouldn't be assessing it. Connections to reticulated service, the fire separation, the inspections to check that the building is in order, compliance with consent notices and council covenants. Building officers often pick up existing unconsented buildings and land uses when they're on the site. And then there is a chance that a building could be sited in a way that makes an existing dwelling non-compliant with the district plan. For example, if you put the granny flat over the current outdoor living space, that would make it non-compliant. It would need a consent.
It goes forever, but I'm mobile now. So.
That's probably the main thing there. And then just some other questions about what happens if there's a change of use, which has already been brought up. Could these buildings present a future liability? If we know they're there and there's an issue in the future, the fact that we know they're there, does that make us liable? Is the register of these buildings meant to just be a register, or are we supposed to have done some checks? We have amenity standards in the district plan, particularly that setback from the front boundary, and we do get complaints when buildings appear to be too close, so that would come into play more. Potential compliance issues, unconsented tiny homes, I think, are keeping our compliance team busy to a degree, and this would be there's potential for further work in that space for them. And the $1,000 fine for failing to notify us of the building, is it enough of a deterrent if you can dodge the development contributions? And then again, that internal floor area is a strange metric. Is that? So these are things that we've identified as potential issues.
Like for us, so not every council uses a development contribution, right? But we do, and we need to. We understand why. But I don't think the government put this proposal together for people to avoid our DCs. So, if 1,000 is not enough, tell them what is. The issues, like even this tiny home thing, that's all some people can afford, you know. Like, if it's really causing issues, what issues and how do we resolve them? Like, I don't want to be the hammer or the handbrake on something that can genuinely help people that can't. There's no other alternative for them. But 60 squares is not big. If you look at our stats, 2.5 people per dwelling is our population, and it's set to grow in that fashion, with 25% in the 65 plus bracket, and set to grow because of the types of not rest homes, what are they? These elderly villages they continue to build. That is a taste of what's more to come, and just adding on a smaller minor dwelling, that's your definition, to an existing property for families. Like, I don't want to hinder that. So, what are the absolutes that you want government to understand, and otherwise let this happen? That's where I'm at the moment. Otherwise, I'm just like, otherwise I don't want to do a submission.
Yeah, I was happy to profile that. I've been on a roller coaster of thinking on this issue, because I started off thinking, coming into this presentation, option 2, yeah, kind of that's where I'm about. And then I listened to David Allen, and he took me on the is this a solution in search of a problem perspective. And then I listened to Mike and Pitihira and the whole property rights prevail, let's be enabling, let's, like there's some there's a bit of risk, but it's minor risk. Should we worry about it? And so where I've landed on is I do think we should make a submission basically supporting the proposals with some suggestions around some minor refinements to address some of the local contextual things like the DCs and the fine level, that kind of thing, and some of the workability of some of those conditions and other things. But I think our sentiment should be enable, we support the direction of travel, but just with some of those minor refinements where I think there's been some consensus around the table. So that's where I've said.
I support both those comments also from both councillors. For me, I'd probably look at some of that. I'd probably still struggle a bit with that common ownership, and just clarifying that. Especially probably more residential, if you had a big enough section and you put a smaller dwelling on, maybe being able to flick that on in time, I see it's probably a bit of benefit. But other than that, I think it's useful. I think just touching on Nina's point earlier around the leaky home stuff, like that was sort of proven to be more the product rather than all about the builder. You're always going to run into a little bit of blurriness around those sort of components and stuff. I think in today's world, if you had a builder that wasn't up to speed, he or she is going to get found out pretty quickly if their work's untoward, if you like. But other than that, I actually support it. I think there's benefit for us, especially when you've got maybe intergenerational sort of family wanting to sort of come together, pull some capital maybe to house extended families. So thanks.
I think we should submit, but I've got a contrary view in saying that we shouldn't actually support it. I don't believe, like David said, we're trying to find a solution to a problem that we don't have. That we only have we already have a process that allows this sort of thing to happen anyway. It seems to be reasonably a reasonably good process. It doesn't restrict people doing what they want at all. It encourages actually people to do that. I'm also very conscious of the fact that we create loopholes for people to use. They will go to the nth degree to explore those and in fact cause us more problems in the long term than what we've got already. And the other thing I think is having a central government policy that gives us no flexibility in terms of what we can do, I think it goes against all the principles of localism and doing what we want to do to make sure that our place is okay. And here we are saying a more restrictive policy in some respects than we've already got at the moment. So I'm, thinking that we can deal with this in our own way rather than having to have a national policy that dictates how we do it. And I'm also very conscious of the problems that will be caused by unconsented properties that we have no control over whatsoever.
Yeah, look, Bernie's captured it very much from there. I support what he said.
I could just add a comment. Previously around the table, we've at times had conversations around maybe particular streets over in the sort of direction here where certain developments have happened and there's buildings being placed in sort of weird arrangements and things like that. And there's been members around the table have said, surely as a planning department, you've got the ability to have some control or some influence or something there. And so some of those have been able to be achieved within current standing settings, I guess. It's, I guess, anticipating this has potential to, I guess, see a few more weird arrangements, I guess, created. And it's, I guess, probably just having that understanding, if this does come in place, that there could be a few more of those things where you'll potentially be the people who get the phone call from the neighbour who says, this building's popped up here, surely they'd get consent, and we simply say no and things. So not casting a view one way or the other, just linking it back to some previous conversations we've had around the table in the past around at what point there's been times where I guess you have probably wanted us to maybe have a little bit more teeth or ability to influence some things based on some of the feedback that you've had from ratepayers.
The example you use over there is that those ugly old homes that have been trucked in. Yeah, well, so according to the conditions, as these are new builds under the current proposed conditions, so we won't get the ugliness that the community were complaining about. And look, if we can't agree and there's division here, it just doesn't happen. There is no submission. That's my understanding. Well, so far, 7 of us have spoken for, against, and 3 for.
Yeah, just for context, I've missed 10 minutes from the transit from West Bank to here, but I've read the pre-document. I guess where I land is I get the point around that this is meant to be enabling, cut the red tape, get small houses built, and that's a good thing for our district and our age, and which should happen. But the fish hooks are the bits that really make me uneasy, and we've got a consent process for a reason. Maybe the answer is a simplified consenting process versus something that incorporates all those fish hooks. So for me, unless they were to reshape it that addresses that consenting process or the risk that's associated with the fish hooks on that, well, if they want to do it, they'll do it. But I wouldn't be supporting it in its current form. To me, it's essential that we do submit, and if we need to take a vote on the table whether or not we submit, that's step one. Step two then is that there's been some really good points raised around those issues where we are uncomfortable, and I think we can identify those in the submission. If there are any points where we have been uncomfortable, where there is a strong view in opposition to those points, we have an opportunity to say it now. Otherwise, we can A, submit, and B, identify those areas of concern.
Direction.
Yeah, well, yes, just probably just pointing out again that the Type 2 order submission does introduce that extra option of a fast track consent process, which would still give the backstop that the building consent provides. And then if they use their $71 million slush fund, I forget the technical term for it, but that means then it's no cost to people that are applying. So that might be a nice middle ground if that's what's the feeling on that one.
Question for you, just because after Bernie spoke, he said some things which I thought were persuasive, but I'm going to come down to this, which is housing action plan. Does this proposal help or hinder or do nothing in terms of a housing action plan?
I think in general it helps the housing action plan, and that the housing action plan does identify a need to enable smaller dwellings. I think everybody has largely agreed with the spirit of this piece of legislation, and that it's trying to enable more affordable living options. That, of course, comes with some trade-offs and some risks, and I think the question that we need to answer are those trade-offs and risks worth it? If the answer fundamentally is yes, then what could we include in a submission that would minimise those risks or help make us feel more comfortable around those trade-offs?
I think
Good question, Sam. So one thing might be stormwater, okay? And another thing might be what you raised, Paul, around the common ownership, fleshing that out a bit, that perhaps the fine of 1,000 is not sufficient when we have an active DC policy, unlike some others. But
Grace,
Those are the top of mind for me. Quite tight on time. So what we've noted down from there is to reference a housing action plan and to potentially suggest some solutions to be included in the process that would address some of those key fish hooks, which we've so far identified as stormwater, the common ownership matter, the fine for not complying with the requirement to notify the council. Was there anything else?
All I was going to say is I look at the Tatura submission and I just think it's too doom and gloom, and so I wouldn't want us to have our submission aligned to that. It needs to be fringe changes, not Is that a fair?
So support the intent, but suggest some process improvements touching on those couple of things that we've just outlined in the last couple of minutes, and to keep it pretty. And so stormwater development contributions and fine for notifying council in the common ownership thing. Perfect.